Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Team Made Apart podcast is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2, relationships squared. Also, financial support comes from teammadeapart.com. Leveraging 20 plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Team Made Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Team Made Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammadeapart.com/talent. That's teammadeapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our Happy Little Podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammadeapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be made in any amount and would go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammadeapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thanks in advance for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Welcome back to the Team Made Apart podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Today's special guest is Hassan Ghiassi. Hassan is an entrepreneur, TEDx speaker, consultant, master dialogue facilitator, and founder of Aristotle's Cafe. Coming from an American-Iranian background, from a young age, Hassan was always fascinated by cross-cultural communication, taking a deep interest in how different cultures and people communicated. That passion led him to develop a communication framework and host community discussions that would bring people together and allow them to make meaningful conversation. Since then, he's made major waves and immeasurable impact, having facilitated more than 1,000 discussions himself, speaking with thousands of people the world over about some of life's most important subjects. Additionally, he's trained a small army of more than 300 facilitators worldwide to share this framework and facilitate discussions that matter. Along the way, Hassan has been given the opportunity to hone his skills in diversity and inclusion, digital marketing, organizational culture, and so much more, now bringing that combined expertise to his facilitated discussions and to the boardrooms of those he consults. Joining us here for what will surely be a podcast that matters, to discuss his perspective on empathy, trust, and leadership communication on remote teams. Please join me in welcoming to the show, Hassan Ghiassi. Hey Hassan, how are you, my friend?
Doing great. What an introduction you have there. I hope I'm not blushing too much. That's really nice. Thank you so much.
Hey, that's pretty good. You're the second guest who's been afraid of blushing, so I must be doing something right, I guess. Well, so let's kick this thing off like sort of at the beginning. I think, you come from a really diverse background. You have a really interesting set of things, and I think you and I have a lot in common in that we both care a lot about people. We both care a lot about conversation, empathy, building relationships, all this kind of stuff. So I think we're going to have a lot of stuff in common that I'm really looking forward to talking on. But let's start a little bit at the beginning. Let's talk about who you are and how you got to where you are.
Yeah. So I think you did a really good job of framing things, but to also kind of talk about my upbringing, I think that might be one of the most important places to start. My dad is from Iran. My mom's American, raised Jewish. And so growing up, I was really in touch with a lot of different languages, cultures, tastes, sounds, ideas, religions. And my family itself is made up of just about every religion there is. So we would go for Easter to one aunt, we would go to Passover to my grandparents, and we just always enjoyed different cultures. And I think growing up in that environment, I saw also big, strong disagreements. and those happen. But I also saw that when there were some techniques in place, some patience, some energy, some other things, that a lot of love can be built. And it's not about being different or being the same. It's just taking the time to figure those things out and find ways forward. So
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, especially coming off sort of, we're recording this in Q1 2021, coming right off a hotly contested American election season when maybe the discourse was as negative and contrarian and back and forth as it could be. It got pretty hot around here. And, but I think, one of those things you keep pointing to is, the common ground between everybody. There's probably something like 90% of our ideologies that would align together as sort of American people. Yet, you wouldn't know that because of how divisive everything was. So I think it's really interesting and great that you point that out.
and I think too, I think taking it even further than just the US, I think it's, as humans, I think across every country, right? I hold these sessions, I hold these open community discussions, and there's always a common thread at the questions that are being asked and the topics that people are really passionate about. And also too, I think for me, one thing that I do want to say on the note of all the polarization we're seeing is that, I've been doing this for 16 years. I personally don't see any difference in what started 16 years ago as a university student as I see now. I just think that more people might be more aware of it. I think it's more, I think there's more awareness across a wide spectrum of people, where as before, it might have been something I was hypersensitive to due to my upbringing or due to the fact that, my name is Hassan Ghiassi and I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. So there was a different path that I charted along those lines. So
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I think that is, one of those things to focus on, especially like you're describing, cross cultures, cross religions, cross all these other things. Like, at the end of the day, we still need, to take care of our family. We still need shelter over our head. We still need food and drink, we still need, like the core stuff is all the same, regardless of who we are. So I think that's a great perspective. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the importance of communication in remote work specifically. So, obviously remote, communication in any line of work and even between people and all that is very important. But one of the things that happens in a remote work environment is you may be, maybe you're all located in the same city, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're worldwide, or maybe you're, even just like, I can really speak from, here in the United States, or I can say also in Spain, but, there are really diverse cultural groups in different parts of even the same country. And so how do we communicate in such a way as to cross these sort of cultural barriers that exist?
yeah, and great question. I think people are going to be more challenged with it than ever. Suddenly, people are remote work by default instead of by choice, right? Which is a new thing that happened. And I also, it's funny, thinking about the conversation that I was going to have with you. There's so much going on, right? There's so many different pieces that we can speak about and talk about. For example, even between 2018 and 2020, right, with COVID happening, it, you know, employees suffering from loneliness skyrocketed, right? 60% of employees feel lonely. If you think about single people working at home or working remotely, suddenly that didn't have a choice to do that, their sense of community is really shattered. They don't have the chance to have those water cooler conversations, those interactions with people. And then another stat that I came across too is about, right, well-being, trust. All these things that are more and more difficult in a remote work environment. So for me, I will say this over and over again, and it's always about discussions. It's always about communication and creating spaces for that are habits, and not just, if something wrong happens, then we have the discussion. So I'm all about creating habits around discussions inside of organizations, and that includes remote work or any kind of organization.
Yeah, I really like the point you made sort of about sort of the water cooler conversation. And what it makes me think of is this is one of these I don't know, sort of philosophical debates that's always going on in my head is what is the role of the employer in our social life, right? So in a traditional co-located office, it's really common for people, especially if you're spending 40 hours a week in the office, a lot of your social interaction comes from work. You're hanging out with people after office hours, or you're, going out to lunch, you're doing all these things. Those are the things you would do with your social group, who just happen to be your work group because that's who you're spending the lion's share of your time with. when you're a remote worker and you're not doing that, all of a sudden now you're on your own. And for these people who've been forced into it versus those who've been doing it by choice, I think the shift to all of a sudden having to be responsible for your own social interaction is something that maybe people weren't ready for or didn't contend with. I mean, like, I've been a remote worker in one way, shape, or form for about 20 years, and I'm very accustomed to working on my own. I'm also an only child, so it comes sort of easy for me. But for a lot of people who are sort of used to drawing their social interaction from work, and then we're all of a sudden just kind of thrown out into the, now you're working at home, I think it's become very apparent. And so I think that isolation thing is really, really something worth discussing.
Yeah, well, so the question of what do employers, where's their responsibility lie? I think it's kind of twofold. One is that culture will be created, right? Like, there will be a culture created, whether they're an active part of it or not. So, in my opinion, I think, more and more also organizations are reaching out to me asking, how do we do this? And not that you necessarily have to revamp or spend lots of money on, a whole new infrastructure or a whole new things. For me, it's about creating intentional moments for people to connect. So I think water cooler conversations are okay as a default, right? When you're in the same space and you're working in that way. But I think better than that too is, why not carve out time to talk a little bit beyond what's happening at work, about life or other things, or really dive deeper and have discussions that matter, because those are the ties that really keep teams together. It's not, it's not silly, frivolous, on the surface things. It's deeper meaning. It's understanding purpose inside of the work that you're doing. It's understanding those things. So I think for me, employers, if they decide to let it just be what it's going to be and just be very task oriented in what they're doing, they'll quickly find out that their bottom line is going to be hurt immensely, right? And I think you've had other guests on the show that talk about this a lot, and all of us talk about this, because in the end, even just if we look at retention alone, right? Even if there's just a high turnover in terms of people that are going to be on the team, then it's already hurting us and costing us thousands, sometimes millions of dollars. So employers need to make this their priority. They need to take it on as their responsibility, because as an individual, right? Individuals are suffering in a way that are thrown into this without asking for it. They're going to suffer in some ways, and they are going to be so determined on what tasks they have to finish, right? They're worried about how they're going to pay rent, what they have to do about the quality of the work. So I really do think it is the employer's job to think about the other pieces, which is creating happiness at work, right? How to create more certainty, how to decrease loneliness in those environments. So I definitely think it's on the employer.
Well, yeah. And, and it's funny too, again, this is one of those sort of philosophical things, but it's like, the things you need to be a great leader are the things that just come with being human, right? So here we are having these conversations, and I mean, you mentioned, we've had lots of guests come on and talk about corporate culture and things like that. And obviously, you also use the keyword, so everybody listening at home, take a shot. We said the word intention again, because that one comes up in every show, but but that's it, right? Is it's being purposeful in the things that we're doing. And, but I think that's kind of where this discussion goes from feeling, like, of course, obviously we need to be putting effort in, but also like it feels kind of scuzzy, because I want people to be intentional but honest, right? Like I want you as a leader, and I think ultimately you have to be if it's going to work. But I mean, the things that make you care or make you actually give a rep about your employees, the empathy, the, giving them time to do these have these interactions and facilitating them, maybe, or giving them the opportunity to do that. Like, that stuff should be the things that just sort of come along with being a person, And so I think it's great if that's not part of your leadership style, that you start being intentional about that and you start working it in there. But I hate to see, or I just feel so funny about it sometimes, because I feel like it should just be such second nature, so maybe it shows how far we've gone from where we ought to be.
Well, it's funny that you say human, because for the sessions that I run, the discussions that I run in the framing and the introduction, we actually start by saying, take 1 hour to be a little bit more human, to turn off your phones, right? To cut off distractions, to be focused and intentional here. And I think that it's, unfortunately, I think we are, no matter where you are, okay, I mean, we can take it outside of the team context, but people are having a hard time figuring out this new reality. People are having a hard time with the rise in technology and just understanding that interface and how to really create authentic connections, how to be authentic, how to communicate authentically. And for me, I think all of us at any level of organization or any job title could use the chance to really reset and just have moments that are carved out to kind of practice that, to kind of, create a stronger foundation for that. And use, it's funny because it should be such a common instinct and just common nature and human of us to approach things a certain way. But I think there are so many different pressures that are coming at us, and so much disruption that sometimes we forget that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And actually, this is something I spend, a lot of time thinking about. I have an article that's called Technological Saturation and the Drive for Things Tangible. And it's basically the concept is that we're overwhelmed with all the technology and the Twitters and the Facebooks of the world and all this kind of stuff. And what we're actually looking for is real life interaction. Hence the the rise of beard oil and craft foods and all this kind of stuff, right? We're looking for real life experiences. And I think it's easy, especially if you're not used to being a remote worker, but really anybody who spends a lot of time immersed in, the absorption of new content and stuff online. You're watching all the videos on how to be a better leader. You're reading all the articles, you're doing all the thing, right? Sometimes it gets just real noisy in there. And sometimes it does make sense, just like you said, to be human, step away from the phone, step away from the whatever, and just kind of go on instinct, right? Like, how to be. Like, you don't necessarily need to go to YouTube or whatever to learn it. Now, you might learn some tricks or you might learn some insights on how to do something in a particular way, or, depending on what you do, maybe this is how you could get trained up or something. But I think, and actually, it's funny, I'm kind of this, walking contradiction, because I am creating content every day, but I've actually made a purposeful step, since 2021 to kind of step away from all this stuff, because I was guilty of doing that, right? I would sit and I would watch leadership videos and I would watch management videos and how do we podcast? How do we do this better? How do we make money? Blah, 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 video. And then I got to the point where it just feels like I can't do anything. Like I'm so saturated with this stuff that it basically paralyzes me and creates total inaction. And so I've made a conscious effort to step away, but I think that that's kind of where people are at, is they've gotten to a point where everything is so easy to get that they don't realize, like, they don't need it all.
And it's well, first off, I just have to key into the fact that I'm really honored to be in the presence of someone else that knows about beard oil, because that doesn't happen every day. But
yeah, I don't get a great beard, I'll tell you that much, but I am aware.
But the thing is that I do think, though, that people in general, they are dealing with a lot of overwhelming things. And it's interesting because even for me, like you mentioned, looking at YouTube and other things and other training stuff, I really have learned most of what I've learned from discussions with people, right? I always, my intention and kind of my philosophy is that the answer that I'm looking for might be one conversation away. So I really am always hungry for the next conversation to have, whether it's here with you and because I think that people's lived experience, no matter where they're coming from, can always teach us much more than we can get in terms of information. And the best thing is that once you find somebody, if they're on your team, if they're working remotely with you, and they might be anywhere in the world, their experience can inform you in so many different ways. And on top of it, you can actually go back and forth and kind of pull out even more pieces if you really know how to pull those gems out, right? So I'm a real lover of the human library and tapping into people's ideas and experiences.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I can share a quick personal anecdote, which is the first time I went to Spain, I was, I don't know, maybe 25 years old, something like that, or no, 35 years old. Jesus, I am getting old. So 35 years old, I go to Spain for the first time. At that point, I'm sort of quintessential American entrepreneur, right? 60-hour weeks and, missing, kids' baseball games so that I can keep my head down and keep working and doing all the ridiculous crap that so many people do, the stereotype. And what happened is I got over there, and it is very apparent that is not how they live life. Right. They immediately took me into social groups and things like that. Even though they didn't know me, I didn't speak the language at the time. I was widely accepted. I was able to kind of just hang out and be one of them. And, it created this sensation or this feeling that I hadn't felt before. Not to say that people here in the States or whatever don't have great relationships and things like that. But for me, this was really impactful, right? It hit me at just the right moment. And so, but had I not been open to, I guess, embracing that experience when I came in, it would have been pretty easy to be like, oh, geez, look at these Spaniards all day on the beach. What are they doing? They should be in the office working. So, but but I luckily and gratefully, I was open and willing to hear that. And so I wonder if you maybe would talk about that a little bit and just sort of how we can be prepared for the conversations that we need to be having, right? So, I mean, so much of our discussion will be around this idea of, how do we have facilitate a meaningful discussion, for example, but how do we prepare ourselves to hear it?
Well, yeah, and that was what I was going to key into in terms of what it means to be human. And I think we just have to recognize first that we are coming at thousands of things with so much bias and so much just so much need to be right. And for that reason, it's not easy to go into those conversations with a level head and with a clear mind. I always say, someone that knows nothing and someone that knows everything will never cause any trouble, right? It's always those of us, and I do it too, that are in between, right? We think we know it, but we don't really. And for that reason, it causes just a lot of turmoil because, there's positioning or things like that happen in organizations. And I think for me, preparing for a conversation that's going to be difficult, you first have to just take a big gulp of intellectual humility and just decide that you really are ready to be wrong, that this is an idea. It is not personal to you. It is not that if someone disagrees with the idea that it's attacking you, that it just, what we do in our sessions and the kind of spaces that I create, and I create brave spaces. I don't believe in safe as much as I do brave, because, there is a need to kind of push and pull, agree and disagree, and that's going to happen. So the thing that I always try to get people to is thinking of an idea as a piece and not part of them, right? That it just is what it is. We can throw it into the center. It can get pushed and pulled around, and that doesn't have anything personal to do with you. So I think for anyone that is going to get ready for a difficult conversation or one that is going to create some kind of tension, just know that that tension is probably needed, and that any kind of pushback that you get is just about that concept and idea. So I think really setting it up in that way, and there's a lot to do with framing that we can talk about, but I think that's the first step.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, even just thinking about sort of my own life experiences, right? I mean, if you say you're in the workplace or something, I mean, you sometimes will need to have a difficult conversation. Maybe sales aren't going good, or so-and-so's got to be let go, or, there's a big layoff coming, or, or maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's just, oh, well, so-and-so got the wrong cake for today's birthday party or whatever it is. But nonetheless, you've got to be able to have that. And I think if you see everything, or if you're set up in such a way that you take everything as an attack, then it's really difficult to make any kind of meaningful progress, and not to keep citing sort of the political stuff, but I mean, at least here in the States, it was very appropriate, it was very, this kind of thing was everywhere, right? Where, no matter what one person of, either party said, the people were going to, be in an uproar over it, and it didn't matter what it was. They were taking everything, as if it was a stab at them, when in real life, it had very little to do with them. It was just this issue or this whatever, that they were disagreeing on. And so I think that's a great point.
Well, too, another thing too, Ryan, is I think we have such a short time to talk, but also too, part of the importance that I should have asked is that, in what context, because you're absolutely right. I mean, when it comes down to, if you have to do layoffs, I mean, that's a much different situation than if it's just a little behavioral, comment or a workflow comment that you have to do, or some feed forward or things like that. And I think for me in general, there's such a small separation between how we're going to deal with our work discussions that matter, that those difficult moments, and also our life, important discussions. And so for me, I personally am someone who believes in doing my best to mimic in both environments and just try to find a way to kind of make peace, or to overcome some challenges together through those processes. So
yeah. Well, and I think, and maybe this is where we can kind of key into a little bit of a discussion on empathy and what that really means. But one of the hot topics that I see anyway right now happening in remote work is this idea of, hey, now we're going back to the office, right? There's a lot of discussion around, should we go back? Kind of, you've got some employers mandating, it's a return back to the office April 1 or whenever. I mean, you've got sort of this broad range of stuff. You've got the statistics, or the at least the remote advocates are pointing out all the studies that are showing everybody wants to stay remote, by a large margin, at least to some degree. And then you've got, the mean old employers on the other end that are trying to force everyone back into the office. And, obviously there's some gray area there. But one of the things that keeps coming up for me is trying to understand where everybody's at beyond this thing, remote or not remote, and you've sort of alluded to this a little bit, is everybody has sort of gone through a trauma, right? For this last year, and maybe some people got out, better than others. Some people, were more resilient than other people, but almost everyone will have lost somebody now, and almost everyone will have maybe lost a job, or been laid off, or couldn't make ends meet, or whatever. Like, so now there's all these new traumas. So these people that you just let go work from home last March, now all of a sudden this March, those aren't the same humans you let go home. Now these people have got, battle wounds and scars and stuff. And I think it's kind of a disservice to try and do this move where it's just like, okay, everybody come back now, it's normal again. I think it actually sort of cheapens the experience everyone's been through if we don't sort of respect the fact that everyone's been traumatized. So how do you think that, business leaders or employers can start looking at, bringing people back in sort of a, I don't know, fair but friendly and safe kind of way where people are feeling supported, but, also getting back to business?
I personally, well, this is going to be interesting because I also, we have to be aware that probably there might be some really, really good reason why people need to go back to the office. There might be some amazing, fantastic reason for it that I just haven't completely figured out yet. I don't know many people that would want to go back either. I don't see, I think that the blinds have kind of been torn down a little bit. We know that it's possible for the majority of organizations. There's, a blended work environment, or, it doesn't have to always be in the office. Maybe there's some touch points. Maybe it's a certain day that people would get together and be in a physical space together, but that's not necessary. I mean, we know that we can work remotely effectively. And so I think that's something that the cat's out of the bag, right? So everyone knows it now. Everyone's adapted to it. There's been investment for, technology inside of organizations to make that more possible. So I think for the most part, there's no more illusion that it's a requirement. And I think when that happened, for the majority of people, there's probably a lot of old school people that have been working in that environment and thinking that's the only way. And now that they switched to this new way of working, it might have been a bit of growing pains at first, but after some time, when they start to kind of get into the rhythm, I'm sure now those individuals too are just thinking, why? What's the reason behind this? So for me, in terms of kind of getting back and figuring that out, well, this is one of the reasons why I think I've been approached so much more recently, is because, leaders need to start talking to their team and figuring these things out, whether it be in a small informal discussion, kind of focus group oriented, asking a few questions, but also just letting the conversation flow. Or, like I'm partnering up with Carolina Zapata, who's my partner for this new project called the Dialogic Approach, where we're offering digital retreats for companies and things like that. And part of that is that getting them to do that now so that they can have some fun together, they can be honest, they can get some skill building around communication, and then they can kind of decide what kind of environment is best for them. And I mean, 100%, no employer is going to want to pull anyone back kicking and screaming, because they're not going to stick around. If you force me to come into work, then I'm probably going to spend a good majority of my time looking for another opportunity that lets me be flexible. So
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, I keep pointing to also, or I think it was Laurel Farrer told me in season 1 of this podcast that basically, as remote work advocates, people aren't actually advocating for remote to be the future of work, right? What they're actually advocating for is flexibility in work. And, and I think, to your point, through COVID, I mean, it's become abundantly clear how flexible we can be, right? I mean, just at the drop of a dime, we can all of a sudden get pretty flexy if we have to. And, maybe it's not ideal, whatever, that's fine. But, at least, you can recognize that you were able to adapt. And, and so now I sort of, again, trying not to be black and white about the issue, but, if you are a company and over these last 9 months, your data shows that remote doesn't work for you, sales are down, everything's down, productivity is way down, whatever. Like, I understand why you might not be totally gung ho and let's keep this remote thing going, right? Like, if you've got data to support the remote's not your thing, or, which I would probably argue is actually more of a leadership problem than anything. But if, for whatever reason, remote's not your thing, I understand the trepidation. But at the same time, I think also, to your point, those people are going to take off running. I mean, if you force them back, they're going to start looking for other opportunity. And I guess we're blessed in this country to have enough opportunity to look around. And so I think, the idea of sort of this, egalitarian rule, and we're going to drag you back to the office and you're just going to go back to the way it once was. I don't think that's going to work very well for the, whatever it was, 32% of employers that want to do that.
But I think, Ryan, I do have to say, I think what you said is really, really correct, which is the people who started in COVID inside the organization, they're not the same individuals. And I mean, I think that's the case for anybody in their working career, 1 year to the next. But I think you're right. There's drastic changes that have happened. And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not so deep into the data on remote work. You probably know it much better than me, but I know people, right? I know about connecting with people. And, if we just look at this empathetically, individuals have had the chance in some cases they're feeling more lonely because they're more secluded. So that's one case of it. But you also have people that, even just with the commute time cut down, that's completely changed their life. That's given them 2, 3, or more hours of their time each and every day. And those 2 or 3 hours means that's time in the morning spending time with their wife or their family or their kids, or whatever it might be. And I think people are realizing right now that the true meaning of work-life balance, which is, I do work and I'm happy to do, if it's purpose for work, I'm happy to do it. And I'm happy to grow in that organization and keep doing that. But, the real thing that we're all searching for are experiences with people that we love, making memories, and those things happen outside of work. They do, so I think it's going to be really backwards for employers not to keep that in mind and not to realize that when they're approaching these situations.
Yeah, well, and I think you're right. I think that'll be one of these things that sort of the market will bear, right? Like, either the market will allow this or not. And so if you are going to try and be draconian and you end up with a bunch of people that bail out and you lose your top people and all that stuff, well, I mean, you're going to have to pivot, right? I mean, if you hope to swim, you're going to have to pivot. And for the companies that are already doing this and who were building a sort of a people first culture prior to the epidemic or pandemic, prior to those times, because there are plenty of companies doing the right thing back then, those guys are going to continue doing the right thing, and these will be the employers sought out by, the people fleeing these other places. So I think you're right. I think basically the market will drive that. And I think eventually it'll sort of get to a place where, we're all more or less happy. And I think, as far as the isolationism and stuff goes, I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean, I can speak from my experience. I've got 2 boys and, I drive them to school every day. I pick them up every day now, all that kind of stuff. And, I've always been flexible, but I know a lot of people like me that are sort of in my age group and maybe have a kid or 2. And, and now they're spending time in the morning, getting them ready for school and doing all that kind of stuff instead of just running off to work. And, I mean, there's, I think, a lot of opportunity there. And I think you would be hard pressed to find a lot of people looking to give that up.
Right.
Now on the other side of that coin, sure, you've got people with, maybe bad work from home situations, maybe too many people living in one home or whatever. And those folks might want to go back to the office. But again, back to this idea of flexibility, that's where it's at, right? So as an employer, the whole thing is just, hear what your people need. And I think you made the point a few minutes ago that, as employers, you ought to be getting your people together and learning what it is they want. Like, let's just talk it out. Let's figure out what everybody needs.
Absolutely.
So let's try and shift a little bit or a little bit further down, and let's start getting, I guess, maybe more into the brass tacks of organizational communication and how we might, start facilitating meetings and things like this when we go back. If we look for or look at sort of, this return to work, whatever it looks like in some sort of hybrid form, let's say we are going to adopt a little bit more of a remote work policy than we, may have at first believed we would, but now all of a sudden we're embracing it. How can we start holding like meaningful meetings and doing things to communicate with our people, now maybe better, because I think there are a lot of companies that maybe, had like one toe back in the way things were. And even though they tolerated this and they did the best they could for the last 9 months or whatever, like now it's maybe becoming apparent this is permanent. So how can those people, I guess, kind of get a fresh start and get moving?
Yeah. Again, I think too, the outcomes that you desire are really important to sculpt out. I'm pretty specialized, right? I really come in to talk about a very specific type of meeting, a very, specific type of situation, which is trying to create a culture where there's trust, a culture where there's the ability to agree and disagree, where there's a culture, that kind of levels the playing field and allows everyone to speak up and to move towards something together as opposed to being directed towards it. So anyone that is trying to lead in a way that is really top down would probably not be interested in what I have to say next. But anyone that's interested in creating that kind of environment, for me, when we talk about having these meetings, and for me it's all about discussions, right? It's all about dialogue. It's all about that sort of thing, which the outcomes can be anywhere from just creating understanding, creating connections on your team, brainstorming, or also, some of these big ideas, or just relaxing, or just having kind of time to chat and have those moments. So if that is your intention, then there's a very specific way to do it. And I've been holding sessions each and every week for the past 16 years. And that framework, I kind of like to model it the same way that I would say a good presentation. There's a really nice beginning, a middle, and an end. And as a facilitator, and the reason why I wear this shirt, when I do these kind of talks or when I am up on stage, is because I think it's important, right? I think there must be a facilitator, whether it's someone in your organization that's trained in that way, or someone that's outside, so that there's not already skin in the game, that they can come in as a neutral party. And I also do this for organizations. But a facilitator really is just there to make things easier. That's it, right? Facilitate is to make any process easy. So facilitators create the best possible process for the group as a whole to lead to the best possible outcomes. We're much different than instructors or leaders or whatever it is, or knowledge experts. We are process experts. And so there are some parts of that. And I would love to talk more about it, but I mean, how deep do you want me to go?
Yeah,
Ryan?
no,
Because
actually, I wouldn't mind getting into it a little bit. I mean, especially one thing, I think that there's a great delineation between sort of what people might think of as a facilitator and what you do in your talks, which is a facilitator is only allowed to ask questions.
right.
As an
Yeah.
example or a piece of process. So if you want to go ahead and break down the sort of the process and how this might work, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So as a kind of as kind of a notice, is that facilitators for me can be anyone in the organization, any job position. It doesn't have to be a certain person. And the role of facilitation, there's a very specific role that I'm going to talk about. But one thing that I want to say is that all these things that I'm going to talk about can be embodied by the team as a whole, which, in my opinion, when you see someone act in these ways, or when you start to have a habit of acting in these ways, or playing this role, just put it on that hat for a second, right? And you can take it off after, but it helps the team be much healthier. And there's a few things for that. So the way that I start my sessions is that, we first need to create a container. And what I mean by that is we need to create some basic ground rules, some basic understanding for how things will work. The introduction is a really important part, but for the most part, when I'm going to sit down with people, either virtually or in person, depending on which way companies are going to go into the future, but everyone's going to be on the same playing field, simple chairs, all on the same level, sitting in a circle. And a tip is to not have anything in between. I find a lot of times we sit in these really stuffy boardrooms with, these big, huge tables in between us. And for me, I always leverage body language. And what I mean by that is that's body language. Like this, if I'm crossing my arms, for people that aren't watching this, just listening, if I'm crossing my arms, that is one barrier between you and me. So why would I want to put in more physical barriers like a big table or be up higher than you are, things like that? So as a facilitator, I want everyone to be on the same playing field, everyone to see each other, everyone to see each other's body language. We can do that on Zoom as well. If I'm on Zoom, I'll also take a small step back so people can see my hands more and they can see more of my body. So I also do this in online meetings as well. But once that happens and once the stage is kind of set, there's a few ground rules and a few things that I might talk about. For example, we come here to have a conversation, to learn more about ourselves and to learn more about each other. This is time for you to be free with your thinking and a time for you to take a little break and be with other humans, as we talked about at the beginning. And then there are a few simple ground rules to keep in mind. First, the facilitator, I'm here to ask questions. This isn't about me. This is all about you. Second, there are no right or wrong answers. Third, be here with us if you can, without distractions, without your phone. And if you're on Zoom, maximize your screen and kind of take off your notifications for a bit. And then also, depending on the outcome that we want, we will either come up with a goal and next steps, or we might leave with just more questions or more fun things to go and do after. And so this is a basic framing. And then the other, I think, really special thing that I do is, depending on how we're doing this, I do not set a question for the discussion. So, for example, if I go in and I'm facilitating a discussion on culture for organization, I will set the topic as culture, but I will actually let the individuals that participate, the whole team individually, they're going to write down anonymous questions and send them in. And part of that process is that I want this to be as participant, as team-centered as it can be. And I don't want anyone to have to worry about asking a stupid question or things like that. And once people write down their questions, the facilitator or me, I'll read them off and the group votes on which question to start with. And even this is just the first 10 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes. And even just in this 10 minutes, you've already got the group agreeing to certain norms. You've already got everyone in the same room taking part in something that they're co-creating, or on the same Zoom call co-creating. And then you also have sourced and understand a bunch about the psyche and what's important to your team before the conversation even starts. So it's a really special way to crowdsource and understand people in a much deeper way. And you're also seeing who's brave enough or who's willing to vote on the certain questions. So then you go through the voting process and you see in your team who's more active, who's more passive, how they like to communicate, how they've kind of approached things so far. And so you can really get a great pulse for who's in the room and who is on your team and who's going to be working with you each and every day.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, a couple of the things that stand out to me at first, and just hearing you describe this session is, typically speaking, when you're just going into a meeting in a boardroom or whatever, maybe it's the boss or maybe it's a team lead, but there's somebody at the front of the room that's sort of just, I guess, spewing down at you, right? There's sort of this top-down kind of communication where you are just there to absorb whatever they say. And maybe you can raise your hand or maybe you can do this or that, but there's somebody driving the conversation. And, this is one of the things I think organizationally that so many people struggle with, right? Because we're sort of used to, CEOs, executive suite, moving your way down sort of through the ranks. But I think that the companies that seem to be thriving, at least as far as people are concerned, is more, everything feels a little more horizontal, right? Even though that, this guy's job may be CEO, he doesn't feel somehow detached from the rest of the team. And so in your facilitation, I love that this facilitator is, yes, running the meeting, but sort of on equal footing with everybody else. Even though they're the one that's sort of driving or running things, they're not really the one steering the ship. And I think that that's a really strong thing, just in that, in terms of making as you called it, a brave space, and giving people room to come in and talk and feel comfortable with their ideas, and not, worry about, do I sound stupid, or am I saying the wrong thing, or whatever. I think that being on sort of the even field, at least emotionally, seems to make a lot of sense. Because I think if you're in a room with your boss or something, you might not say something if it comes out stupid, So I think being able to do that among your coworkers, but also positioning whoever this person is as the facilitator, even if it is a team lead or whatever, it is missing the component that makes them feel like your boss, right? They somehow now feel like they're a piece of the organization, or a part of this process we're going through. So I really love that.
And a lot of, there's like so much to talk about. So a lot of times too, the way that I run sessions, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? This is the introduction. We're not talking about dealing with, aggression. Let's say aggression. People are a little bit more, open to talking, might push a little bit more, or people that are, things might get emotional or tense or things like that, especially with organizations that have history or teams. And then also too, a few things that I want to say, but the construction of that is really important. Because if you have a leader or CEO that's facilitating, and everyone already knows their ideas or opinions on the subject, you'll get what you're saying, which is people will speak in a way that positions them and aligns them with that individual. But on the other hand, if that leader is sitting in the room with everybody, then they might share every now and then, but they might also just listen. So they kind of get the chance to speak up when they feel necessary, but they can also sit back and kind of be there with everybody else, instead of being at the head and having that pressure. So it takes a lot of pressure off of leaders as well in those moments, and just playing a different role for a second. But also with teams that I lead, and historically when I was a director of marketing in Thailand for a university, I had a very mixed culture team. And a really important thing that I always say is that you don't always have to facilitate, but I think it's good to know how to do it. And so what that means is that sometimes I'll ask my team a question, and that's because I really don't know, and I really want to source their information. Or sometimes I'm asking them a question to know if they're okay with being on board. Or sometimes I'll let them know that this is the decision and this is how we're moving forward, right? But I think it's just good to know which gear to be in, and not just drive in one lane, and not just be have one strategy.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, and I think too, it might make sense to discuss a little more in depth too, this idea of sort of using inquiry to find your way through things. I think, we talked about them earlier, sort of the know nothings or the know it alls. And, that sort of in between position, that middle gear, I think, is this idea where you're actually curious about stuff. Don't approach any situation or any particular individual with some sort of predisposed idea of what they should be doing or should know or don't know. Rather this, using questions to drive an answer, I think is, a smart approach.
Yeah. So I've developed something. I'm glad you asked that. And as I said again, these discussions for me, facilitating these, are a lot like a presentation. You have the beginning, the middle, and the end. And in the middle, there's a lot of really important pieces, like the body of the presentation, of the speech. And the reason why it's so important in terms of facilitating is that the way that I set up my conversations are extremely emergent, right? It's about who's in the room. It's about the topic. It's about how everyone's feeling. And also, we don't have set questions, because they're spur of the moment. They're decided on the spot. So another thing too that I think that I've heard that is quite unique about what I do is that I really believe in tailoring questions to the group and creating that kind of flow. And I've developed something called the Epiphany Question method. And it's something that I've developed over all these years, which really ties directly into what you're saying. And the way that works in a simple way, because it's complicated, it's hard to explain, it's hard to train, it's hard to show people how to do it, but it's a process. And that process basically is that you know that just human nature wise, if someone tells you, I love chocolate, and directly after you're going to tell them that chocolate is the most unhealthy thing, that it's bad for you, that it'll kill you, you know that it's gonna mean that that person is going to shut down and stop listening to you, because it's too big of a jump. So the Epiphany question method is all about creating trails of questions that are tailored to the group, are tailored to what's said in the room. And it's the idea that there's kind of an arc of questions that allow people to share, hear from each other. And then there's kind of the fourth or fifth question is the time that you might throw in something that might create an epiphany of sorts for the group as a whole. That might be a new way of thinking, a new way of operating, and you let them find their way to it. Because another thing too that I think is really true and that we all know instinctually is that we really move towards things and we accept things when we find our own answers, as opposed to being told what's right or wrong. And so that's what that process does.
Yeah, no, I can tell you that that's the case. Just using my kids as an example, we tell them, what to do, what not to do all the time. And, we're always the big idiots until they've stubbed their toe or burned their finger. And then all of a sudden they get it. So I think it's important that we discover for ourselves, right? I had somebody tell me the other day, and I thought this was an interesting way of thinking about it, is that basically we always come to the table with our set of facts in our head. And so when we arrive in our facilitated meeting, what's in our head is the things that we know to date, right? It's everything we've learned so far. So we're going to come in there and we're going to frame everything that we hear and see and talk about in the frame of the things that we already know, right? And so it does take work, and it does require self-discovery, I think, to start uncovering, meaningful nuggets, because you can't get to those things until you've sort of, I guess, gotten outside of what you already knew.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, sort of post-facilitation. So we've gotten through this facilitated meeting. We've had this impactful discussion. We've uncovered a lot of things. But how do I, as a leader, start to, I guess, act on this stuff? What do we start, what's sort of next step after we've had this discussion?
Even in your question, it's so interesting because my answer is don't stop, right? Do not make a one-off discussion. Make it part of a habit, make it part of the culture, make it something that happens each and every week, because the arc of kind of connection and growth comes in that way, right? I think that sometimes we think, and I put it on trainings, right? I put on communication trainings or things like that. And I work in a lot of ways like that. And I always really enjoy giving people tools they need when they need it. And sometimes that is a one-off activity. But when it comes to things like communication or culture or teamwork or connections, it really needs to be, I think, a habit. And so I think, firstly, as a leader, when I leave that conversation, I'm going to take a really deep look at all the questions that were submitted. I'm going to really think about what was said in that meeting. And I'm going to start to figure out how to connect with people, just how to have more nice, friendly conversations around different things, because there's going to be some commonalities that are kind of exposed and shown there. And I would dive right into that. And I would keep doing it until it becomes a habit and until it becomes the default instead of something that we're trying for. And, with that being said, there's also a lot of other pieces that might be uncovered, right? Sometimes it's about finding strengths in your team that you didn't know that existed, right? Learning a skill that someone had that you didn't even know about, or learning that there is some history or someone has a connection with somebody that might help the organization, or some relationship or some history that was not known to you before. I think that is also another really beautiful part of these emergent conversations, that if you get into the habit of them, that is more and more what happens.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I probably should ask this sooner, but as a manager, as a leader, I mean, do they participate in these discussions? So I mean, we talked earlier about sort of, leveling the playing field and everyone being in sort of this brave space where they could speak kind of openly. I mean, would you encourage a manager to sit in that discussion and actually be a part of it, or are they better to analyze the results afterwards?
I think it depends. I think, you know, it all depends. If you're going, if you're, no one has to be part of every meeting. Okay, I should say that right now. No one has to be part of every single meeting. I think that, if if there's been some sort of issue that needs to be addressed, it depends. If there's some sort of brainstorming that happens, it depends. I think it all depends. And that'll have to be figured out on a case by case basis. I think for me, when it comes to just creating that environment, teams, when it's really easy, when it's like a really easy way to say that the manager should be there, is typically when managers or CEOs will invite me in and have a conversation with their team around learning these skills, like learning the skills of facilitation. So I'll typically run through a discussion with them on a topic that they want to choose, right? A certain topic, and then we crowdsource the questions. And then we do a discussion, and then directly after, I talk about skills and different approaches and techniques that they might be interested to use throughout their day and throughout their week. And that's a really nice way, because what happens is that leaders can then say, hey, I might have been doing this in some way or not, but I want to do it more. And for that reason, we're going to have kind of this first initial dip into the water. And I'm going to let you know that my intentions are really, really good. And I have a thought around creating this connection and creating this space for you. And I think that's a really great way, before an incident happens, before there has to be an overhaul, to just kind of, start walking in that direction and letting your team know that you have that in mind, and letting them also help you in terms of which way and which direction they want to take it, because that's also part of that process.
Well, and I think it's so interesting or important also, just sort of that strictly by your leadership, your manager, your whomever, sort of walking this walk. I think that demonstrates, where they are in their sort of leadership style and how they feel about the people they work with and that kind of thing. So I think it's also a great example just for people to sort of demonstrate that they're in the right spot. So I think that's really good. So here in the last few minutes, I wanted to see if you would maybe take a minute and, we can get out of remote work for a second, but just sort of talk about your Aristotle's Cafe stuff. I mean, we've talked about a lot of how this is working in the workplace and how people can apply this in the remote workspace. But I think you're also just doing a lot of like human good. And so I wonder if you just talk quickly about that, how people can get involved, where they can learn more about it.
Thanks. Yeah, Aristotle's Cafe is really a passion project and something that I'm just so, it means so much to me. Aristotle's Cafe is a space and something that we do each and every week for the past 16 years. We're now in Iceland, Myanmar, Mongolia, Indonesia, Thailand, India, and of course the US. And there's a lot of work that I'm doing with that. Most recently, I've worked with the Oklahoma City National Memorial Museum to create a project called Better Conversations for their 25th anniversary. We brought together all sorts of people to learn these skills and to figure out how to have better conversations. And that's all based off of the framework of Aristotle's Cafe and molded and adapted to exactly what they had in mind. But we welcome everyone in. You can come and have a discussion with us online each and every week. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm often posting about that and tagging new connections and letting them know that that's available. And really, this is just a moment for you to find out more about people, more about yourself, and getting in the habit of having conversations and just diving into those. Those are completely free. They will always be free and open to anyone that wants to come. We have mothers in rural areas of India. We have people that are studying right now in the US. We have in different languages. We have it in Thai, we have it in Icelandic. We're working with youth, we're working with the elderly. We're really doing our best to just spread the message of having more discussions that matter, and the fact that that really makes a better world. And I really am a believer of the quality of the questions that we ask determine the quality of our discussions, and the quality of our discussions determines the quality of our lives. And so I'm on a real mission to do that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's just amazing. You mentioned LinkedIn. Where's the best spot for people to track you down if they're interested in working with you, either as a facilitator or, maybe they want to get involved with the Aristotle's Cafe movement?
Absolutely. So LinkedIn, Hassan Ghiassi, they can find me there. I'm getting more and more active on there. I tried not to, but it seems like a necessary evil and a great place to connect with people. And then also Aristotle's Cafe, I really want to separate kind of two things that I've always been drawn to in my life. So Aristotle's Cafe is much more of the community effort and things like that. People can always see the website there, get in touch, aristotelscafe.com. And now the offering that I'm doing for companies and organizations and professional individuals is dialogic, the dialogic approach. So that's dia-logic.com. And then is really taking all those skills and information and all that experience and putting it into the organizational setting and helping organizations thrive and strive at this time.
Awesome. Well, hey, that is so great, Hassan. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. It's been an awesome conversation. Grateful to have you.
Likewise. Thanks, Ryan.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes in this week and every week. And we'll see everybody next time.
I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you anything.